Hunter, question right off the bat, as usual. Can you recall every country that was involved in World War I? The big Uno, as we like to call it.
Every country. Wow. Okay.
Every country.
It's a very geographical question about historical situation.
And we're a big geographical podcast.
That's right. So it makes sense. All right. I'm on the spot. All right. So Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yep.
The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the British Empire.
A lot of empires.
Right. Yeah, and some of these empires are going to change pretty dramatically by the end of this situation. So France, and then I felt like those are probably the major players. The United States enters, of course, and probably Canada gets involved in some way. I know some battles are waged in Africa, and probably further afield as well. But that's what I'm going to go with as my response for now.
I mean, you named the biggies, including the United States, who is, I mean, I would argue is not necessarily a biggie within the context of this war. They do come in sort of at the end. You could have also said Italy and Bulgaria. They were also tied in there in some way.
Yeah, Italy would have been a good one.
What I liked about this question for our intro, Hunter, is that it really frames this idea that, so we call this World War I. At one point it was called the Great War, but we call it World War I. It really frames it as what makes this a world war, right? Because you listed 6 countries that are all basically heavily European based. I mean, you can argue Russia and the Ottoman Empire are potentially more Asian than Europe, but broadly it's all, inside that geopolitical area of Europe. And sure, there were battles elsewhere. There was colonies involved. But was this really a world war? And I think that's something that's like, maybe, but kind of mostly a European war.
Yeah, I mean, others were involved and fighting took place in places outside of Europe, but it's maybe a reach to call it a world war. I mean, it had ramifications across the world. So, but a lot of wars have that as well. So, I guess maybe because it was such a massive conflict, that name stuck. It'd be interesting. Do you know how that name was adopted, or is that something from the U.S. perspective, or is that kind of across countries?
I don't have that question. Maybe that's something we can dig up for a future episode. If we ever do World War II, for example, maybe we'll dive into a little bit about the history of the nomenclature of the sort of the naming devices here.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it's called different things in different places, and depending on where, maybe has a big influence in how it's framed, right?
That's a good point. It kind of makes me think of, if World War I is a quote unquote world war, it kind of makes me think, if you go back to the mid to late 1700s, there was the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, and that would include the what we call here in the United States the French and Indian War. But this war was being fought all around the world, and it kind of makes me think, well, if World War I is a world war, then why is the 7 Years' War in the mid-1700s also not a world war? Because there's battles being fought in Asia, Europe, and the Americas.
Right, that sounds pretty global to me. Yeah,
sounds very global. So,
but of course, there's certain parts of the world that are perhaps not involved in these conflicts, but they probably feel an impact in some way, perhaps, because if the most powerful countries in the world are at conflict, economies are ruptured, there's knock-on effects.
That reminds me of our episode that we did on the Nile River when we were talking about sort of the growth of the cotton industry in Egypt and how that was a direct result of the Civil War in the United States. Nothing exists inside a vacuum, right? So there's ramifications, and we're going to talk all about that today.
To be made, and that's what we're here for.
Exactly. So let's get to sort of why we're talking about world wars today. In fact, we're going to be talking a lot about World War I. That's the subject of today's video. This is the first time that we're talking about a major war on this podcast. We sort of touched on little wars here and there as part of other topics. This is the first one, sort of the focal point is. And that's right. We'll likely do other wars in the future. I mean, World War II is obviously the other big one, but we've also hit on some other conflicts. And I think to what we just said, nothing exists in a vacuum. When one of these things happen, especially one of these globally defining things, there are reverberations. There are geographic reverberations throughout. And so that's kind of the historical fun we can have looking back. Obviously, they weren't fun during the time, and I'm definitely not here to make that claim. But the historical fun is just, for us, an academic sort of angle. We can look back and say, oh, we can see some of these, see some of what happened and how that sort of shook things up afterwards. I also kind of wanted to talk about World War I today, Hunter, because it is kind of, and you can also make this argument for World War II, it's kind of fading from history a little bit, or at least our collective remembrance of it.
Yeah, I think that there aren't too many people who were alive during World War I. There might be a few people still left, but they would have been very young and pretty old right now. So that's sort of human aspect of memory. It's all researched by people who haven't been there. And World War II, I mean, there's World War II people who lived through World War II still alive and have memories of that. But that's, in 10 years or 15 years, that will probably be different too, inevitably. And so, yeah, I mean, we're focused on more contemporary situations, which is important, but, going back into history and finding out about these giant conflicts can only help us understand the world better today.
Absolutely. And so we're going to talk all about sort of World War I. We're going to talk about the global ramifications, what comes after. We're going to talk about some of the history, the geography involved, of course. This is also going to be a little bit of a different kind of episode, Hunter, because, well, I guess the episode that listener you're listening to today will be fairly normal to our usual style. However, if you come back in 2 days, there's going to be a whole new kind of episode. It will be our very first ever guest episode where we are going to talk to Jesse Alexander from Real Time History and the Great War YouTube channels. And he's going to provide all of that wonderful expert context that as geographers, we simply just don't have. And we've made that claim many times here before.
Fantastically knowledgeable about not just World War I, but World War I in particular. Has a couple YouTube channels that if you check it out, and they'll be in the notes, fantastic. Really somebody compelling to listen to. So definitely tune in a couple days and check out this new bonus aspect of what we're doing here, the interview part of the World War I episode.
Yeah, we're aiming to do more of these. So it seems like it'll work out this time. Obviously the topic works out, but this is something that I think we're going to keep trying to do. So again, come back on Thursday, listen to that. For now, let's go ahead and dive into today's episode all about World War I. Specifically, we're going to dive into the geography, right? So this first part, we're just going to talk about the geography. I tried really hard not to make this a boilerplate history of World War I episode because I think that's pretty easy to do. And well, for one, I'm not a historian myself. I'm a geographer. So that's kind of what I want to talk about anyways. The reality is that we will need to talk about the history. Obviously, the whole thing's steeped in history because it's taking place about 100 years ago. However, we're not going to necessarily go year by year, aside from part 2, or the second part of today's episode, I should say, where we're going to do a little bit of that because you can't really escape it too much.
We're trying to bring a geographical twist to the way that World War I is usually talked about.
Right, exactly. So, Hunter, another question for you, and we kind of already talked about this, but let's do a little refresher here. Why do you think we call it a world war?
Well, if it's we in the United States, it might be because this was a massive conflict where actually ended up losing a lot of soldiers. It disrupted political and economic relations that the United States was heavily involved in. And it tied in some of the major powers, not all of them, but some of the major powers in the world. So, I mean, I guess, and we talked about it a little bit, I guess that's the world part of it.
Right. And I would make sort of a similar argument. I think it might have been one of the world's great wars that really had that sort of, for lack of a better term, the domino effect, right? Where there were different countries had different treaties with other countries, where as soon as things started to topple, it sort of kept pulling things into it via these treaties. And I think that might be one of the key establishing factors that wars that came before it didn't really have, at least not to the same degree. And of course, we then see that again in World War II, right? And I think that sort of plays into the geography of it all. Obviously, World War I is primarily a European war. I mean, there's just no way around it. Most of the battles were fought there. That's not to say there weren't battles fought elsewhere, or even important battles fought elsewhere. But most of the battles, and including the vast majority of the loss of life, did occur on the European continent.
There's something else, too, I think that we should consider, which is that this is a huge conflict that happened in the context of the emergence of mass communication. So there's radio, there's newspapers that are starting to become not just national, but global in some ways. There's ways to communicate that didn't exist before. And so based on the communication that existed, the world was able to sort of track what was going on in a way that might not have been possible in other wars. So that might also be part of it too.
Absolutely. That's a great contextual sort of addition to this conversation, Hunter, is technology. This is sort of the beginning of that, or not, I wouldn't say the beginning, but this is sort of in the midst of that period of time when technology is just rapidly increasing, right? And so like, trains, for example, hadn't been around for that long. And during World War I, we had a whole episode on air travel. During World War I, this is when they're starting to figure out how to fly, and that starts to factor into warfare as well.
They went quickly from learning to fly to using planes in war. They didn't figure as prominently as in World War II, but it's still part of what went on.
Exactly. So let's dive into the geography of World War I. World War I, also known as the Great War, depending on maybe where you're from, was a global-ish, is what I'm going to call it, global-ish conflict that lasted from about 1914 to 1918 and involved many of the world's great military powers at the time. And so the primary alliances that were involved here were the Allies, also known as the Triple Entente, and the Central Powers. And so the Allies would initially include France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. It would later be joined by Italy, Japan, and the United States, among some other countries, such as, it's kind of, Canada obviously was involved. They were also very heavily tied to the United Kingdom. So in a lot of what I was reading, it's like they were just so married at the time that it was still hard to sort of pull them apart. And I think that gets a little bit more separated for World War II, right? When you actually get more of a mention of Canadian involvement as an independent entity. Canadians, that I'm not saying that Canada was not an independent entity at this time. I'm just saying this is sort of the historical records is how they were being kept. And so I'm not trying to exclude them. Same with New Zealand and Australia, who were also involved, as well as India, which was also a big British protectorate colony, whatever you want to call it at the time.
Right, because the British Empire was still firing pretty on all cylinders. There was pretty extensive holding still, and that starts to change. But at this point, the British Empire, the sun never sets kind of thing.
Right, absolutely, yes. On the other side of that was the Central Powers. This would be comprised of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and then later Bulgaria. Now, there's already two countries that I've mentioned here that don't really exist anymore, at least not in the same form. Hunter, what are those two countries?
Well, the Ottoman Empire. There's no Ottoman Empire anymore. And then Austrian-Hungarian Empire doesn't. There's countries named Austria and Hungary, but that's not the empire that it was at the time of World War I.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's Austria, there's Hungary, but Austria plus Hungary today does not equal what the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was. Right. These aren't right. These aren't the same thing. So it's worth pointing out that during this time, both of these sort of countries, the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, were major powers during the time. And I think there's some arguments that go back and forth with historians about how major they were, but I would argue that they were still very major within the world, the global sphere. So in Europe, the Western Front was the main theater of war, stretching from the North Sea coast of Belgium southward through France. And this is kind of where we get a lot of the images and sort of iconography of trench warfare, right? It sort of dominated that sort of landscape, with the front line really not moving over the course of the war, right? Sort of you just bunker in, And then all of a sudden there's artillery and machine gun, and it sort of creates this area where it's like, okay, that's kind of a stalemate. It's geographically very hard to move when in any given direction.
Yeah, the new technologies, countries are still figuring out how to mobilize and use those. And it, of course, became a famously grisly situation, trench warfare. I mean, warfare is brutal, but trench warfare is sort of another level in some ways.
Right. I mean, you have to think about, again, you alluded to the technology at the time. You know, if you jump ahead to wars that come after World War I, you have, technology that moves troops around faster, is far more armored, and gives you air superiority. And I think that is sort of World War I is sort of on the cusp of all those things, but the technology is not quite there. So they're just not as effective. And therefore, falling back onto something like trench warfare, there's just not a whole lot of movement unless you're throwing a lot of manpower, basically a lot of people to die to actually move that border a very small distance. So it's a very interesting period of time in terms of, I would argue, in times of warfare. It gets a little grisly. One of the largest and deadliest battles was such as the Battle of Somme and the Battle of Verdun. These both occurred on the Western Front. Verdun alone resulted in an estimated 700,000 casualties, while the Battle of Somme had over 1 million casualties, according to historic records. These are numbers that are unheard of in sort of modern warfare. That's not to say people.
It's astonishing. Yeah, it's
astonishing. Yes.
Yeah.
And you also have to think, 100 years ago, the global human population was so much less. So the impact of losing 1 million people, and again, I'm trying to thread this needle here, where I'm not trying to downplay sort of warfare today, but the impact felt by losing 1 million men, let's say, for a country in 1914 would have been felt much more severely than today. Again, not trying to downplay anything that any of the warfare that goes on today.
But today would still be a lot, but the population was a fraction. The population of the planet was like a quarter or something of what it is today.
Switching to the other side of the war, right? Because this isn't just on the French and UK side between Germany. If we go over to the Eastern Front, this stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and involved battles mostly between Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side and then Russia on the other. This front was characterized by more fluid movements compared to the stagnant trench warfare of the West. And this was largely due to the fact that Russia was far less industrialized and therefore and far bigger, right? And therefore, France and Austria-Hungary had a lot more leeway in how they moved their troops around. It ultimately wouldn't work out super great for them, which we'll get to in a little bit. Some key battles included the Battle of Tannenberg and the Brusilov offensive. Then there was the Southern Front, which involved the Balkans, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. Italy fought against Austria and Hungary along the mountainous border with significant battles such as the Battle of Caporetto. Italy would come in later in the war. Originally, they were an ally of the Central Powers, but they decided to not be at the beginning of the war when that broke out, and then ultimately would join the Allies later in the war. So it's a little bit of some geopolitical, I would argue, some wise geopolitical maneuvering by probably the Italians at the time. In the Balkans, Serbia, Montenegro, and later Greece faced the Central Powers, and so this would be largely against the Ottoman Empire. Then the Ottoman Empire, but Greece and Turkey today, very contentious histories dating back literally thousands of years.
But the modern aspect of that conflict has a lot of roots in what happened 100 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So let's get outside of Europe a little bit. Again, we're trying to tackle the geography in this section. So let's go over to Southwest Asia, or more commonly known as Middle East. This saw the Ottoman Empire fighting against the British Empire and its allies in that sort of area. So there were some significant campaigns that included the Gallipoli campaign, the Arab Revolt. So again, the British Empire was trying to lean on Arab nationalist sentiments to basically rise up against the Ottoman Empire, which was focused in modern day Turkey, right? And I know there's, especially coming from an American or US or European sort of mind frame, it's probably easy to look at that region and assume that, there's a homogeneity there when there really isn't. It's
Not at
very
all.
quite complex.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this is one of those ways that the British were trying to leverage that. It's like, okay, the Arabs would want to be free from the Ottoman Empire at the time, and they did, and they very much wanted to be free. There were some battles over here that also included the control of the Suez Canal, which was completed only about a few decades prior to this, as well as sort of modern-day Iraq, sort of the Mesopotamia region, historically known as. Moving into Africa, there was clashes between the colonial powers that mostly controlled the continent at the time. So there was fighting in German East Africa, which would be the modern-day country of Tanzania today, the German Southwest Africa, which would be Namibia, and Togoland, which is today known as Togo, among some other places. So these campaigns were often marked by more guerrilla kind of warfare, from what I could read, and less sort of, again, if we think back to the trench warfare of Western Europe, right? That's more of a traditional kind of warfare. This was much more guerrilla, much more hit and run. And this really did speak to a lot of the geography that, even during this time, Europe was very built up, industrialized, and Africa simply wasn't, right? And so there wasn't really the same kind of geography for which to fight a traditional war. It just wasn't really amenable to that. And I think you're seeing that a little bit inside this theater of the war. Again, most of this warfare that we just sort of ran through is still contained within these countries that are European-based, right? And so this is kind of where we get to the aspect of it's a world war because there's battles fighting everywhere around the world. But it's not like, the independent Tanzanians are, joining of their own volition, necessarily, and that they have a real big gripe against the British. Maybe they did, but
it's global in the sense that these are huge colonial powers, some of them that are involved. And so they have claimed territories across the world. And so that is another strand of that. Why is this a world war?
Absolutely. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about the history here in part two of today's episode. There was a lot of involvement amongst a lot of different places. So I have some key figures here. So France mobilized about 8.5 million men as part of this war. The United Kingdom about 6 million, and Russia over 12 million. This is over the course of the war, of course. This isn't always at the beginning of the war. Mm-hmm. On the other side, Germany had about 11 million total. Austria-Hungary about 7.8 million. And then the Ottoman Empire, a relatively small 2.9 million, relatively doing a lot of heavy lifting there because that's still a lot of men. The United States, which would enter in 1917, would supply about 4 million soldiers. I believe India would supply about 1 million themselves as well. And of course, there's a lot of other, troops that are being deployed from the various colonies that we don't have strong records for necessarily, right? Maybe it exists out there, but it's not as well kept as some of the records we have for the countries themselves. Getting to the end of the war, again, we're just focusing on the geography here. Right. Getting to the end of the war, the Treaty of Versailles, amongst a lot of other treaties, which was signed in 1919, imposed really harsh penalties on sort of the losers of the war, which would be the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and Germany, and redrew a lot of the map of Europe. And so we're going to talk about this way more in depth at the sort of last part of our episode, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, as you already stated, Hunter, gone. Simply don't exist anymore.
Right. And in the case of the Ottoman Empire, was an empire that was around for hundreds of years.
Right. Yeah. And so there would be several new countries created out of this vacuum, right? So Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, for example, all new countries. These places do have histories of being independent entities throughout European history, but they sort of get assumed, and then this is their sort of newly acquired freedom from these empires. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania also gained independence from Russia for a brief period of time.
Right, for a little while.
A little while, yes. I really wish I had more time to expand on sort of the Baltic states because they have a really fascinating history. And I actually did a little bit of research on it that we don't have enough time to get into today. But I think they should be their own episode soon, Hunter. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Yeah, let's do that.
Over in the Southwest Asia or the Middle East, the territories of the defeated Ottoman Empire were divided into mandates under the control of Britain and France, which would eventually lead to modern-day countries of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Obviously, there's a lot of issues when you do that. That's a whole other episode. We can't really breach on this topic of World War I. But these are just some of the geographic impacts that sort of spawn out of World War I. There is so much more we could talk about with respects to the geography of World War I. It's kind of insane that we have to. I mean, we're going to keep talking about the geography when we go through the history, but there's just so much to this war, which is why we have a guest coming on in a couple of days. But we're going to go ahead and jump to our very first ad break, and then we will be back to talk all about the history and sort of how things sort of occurred through the timeline, because that will then lead us to our final segment, all about the global impacts of this war and sort of what happened. And so with that, we will be right back. And we're back. This is the Geography is Everything podcast. We are talking all about World War I. We just ran through a bunch of geography. Now we're going to dive into a bit of the history. Again, this is going to be highly abbreviated. We're going to try and cram in World War into like 20 minutes of conversation here, which is probably insane, but here we are. This is our task for the day. So prior to the war, let's talk about sort of what was building up to it a little bit. And I think somebody who might be familiar with World War I, none of this is going to be super surprising, but before the war, Europe was a continent of competing empires, right? You had the French Empire, you had the British Empire, you had the Austrian, German, Russian, and Ottoman Empire. All of these things, they were all competing, and there was complex alliances that were being built, right? This was also a time of rising nationalism, militarism, rivalries, and again, those same alliances, when you start piling all those on top of each other, you can start seeing that there's a rather tense atmosphere building, to say the very least. Major powers, including Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, were all engaged in an arms race at the time, and there was territorial disputes as well, right? So we talked about this in part one. Technology was getting better and faster and more directly applicable year by year, right? So whoever had the best technology was seen as having the upper hand. And so all of these countries were engaged in this race to have the best, whatever it was at the time, right? So for example, the humble machine gun, which seems pretty commonplace today, unfortunately, was brand new at the time, right? During the course of the war, you went from having sort of regular sort of rifles, single shot rifles, to having machine guns, which could cause a lot more damage. Hunter, there was one person though that I think probably gets attributed more than anybody else as being the cause of, well, maybe not the cause himself of World War I, though I'm sure he had some sort of hand in it, but what happened to him. Do you know who I'm talking about right now?
I believe you're talking about Franz Ferdinand.
Absolutely. Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Do you know anything about him?
Well, I know there's a band named after him, but that's to the side. I think he was in line to becoming the leader of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and then somebody killed him.
Yep. I mean, exactly, right? So this is probably not a huge surprise to anybody who's listening to this who knows about World War I, but the most immediate cause, and obviously there's things that come afterward and there's things that come before, but this is sort of one of those linchpin moments that the historians have identified. So the most immediate cause was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary on June 28th, 1914 in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. And so while any assassination of a major world leader is a big event, I don't think anybody would argue otherwise, this event did seem to trigger a series of diplomatic crises, known as the July Crisis. Austria-Hungary, with the backing of Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia, which led to the declaration of war on July 28th, 1914. So Austria-Hungary was trying to basically consume Serbia into their empire, something that they had been trying to do for a while. This was sort of the, well, for lack of a better word, the ammunition that they needed in order to make that justification. Unfortunately for Austria-Hungary, this declaration of war against Serbia immediately started to draw in some of these intricate treaties and alliances that we've already spoken about. So the intricate system of alliances quickly drew in other major powers into the conflict. So Russia mobilized in support of Serbia, which prompted Germany to declare war on Russia on August 1st, 1914. So again, if you're keeping track, listener, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, had the backing of Germany because they were allies, which then triggered Russia, which then triggered Germany to declare war on Russia. So the Eastern Front already starting to get really hot, right? We're already starting to see how this is starting to unfold a little bit.
These are in the weeks after the assassination of the Archduke, right?
Yes, this is. These are, yeah. So the assassination was June 28th. Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28th, so 1 month later. And then Russia declared war and mobilized on August 1st, and Germany declared war on France on August 3rd. And so this is all sort of piling on each other over the course of a matter of weeks. And you can just imagine sort of, especially given the communications technology that you spoke about in the first part, everything that was going on, how fast this was all happening, seemingly, right? So Germany would declare war on France on August 3rd, as I already stated. And this was because France and Russia had an alliance. And they would invade Belgium to execute the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy to Schlieffen? Schlieffen Plan.
I remember studying this extensively in European diplomatic history with some friends in college.
Maybe you can tell me a little bit more about it. All I have here is that it was a strategy to avoid a two-front war by quickly defeating France before Germany turns to fight Russia, which seems like a really good plan to me, because if you're looking on a map of all of these now battling countries, it really seems like Germany and Austria-Hungary are not fighting from a position of advantage here. They're kind of pincered in between.
Right. They're surrounded, right? And so I guess the idea is to take what was perceived to be as maybe the easier conflict and take over the Western Front, and then put most of the attention on the Eastern Front. But it didn't work out like that. Right.
And, listener, if you're unaware, back in 1870, there was the Franco-Prussian War, which is, I guess, in some ways a precursor to World War I, where France and Prussia, but obviously that would become Germany. Anyways, let's get over the names. Prussia and Germany, basically the same for the purpose of this conversation. They went to war with each other, and Germany and / Prussia really handed it to France really bad, right? So they decisively won that war. And so Germany was kind of thinking that they could follow that up and kind of finish off France once and for all. I think that was kind of maybe the internal logic they had going. So they would invade Belgium in order to have that pathway into France more easily. No pesky Alps getting in the way. Unfortunately for Germany, this was a violation of Belgian neutrality, which would lead the United Kingdom to declare war on Germany on August 4th, 1914. And so Belgium seems to have this interesting place in European war history where it finds itself in this exact position at least one more time during World War II.
That's right. And I think the sort of geographical situation that you outlined has a lot to do with it. So This is, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg are called the Low Countries because it's not very mountainous. It's
exactly
a lot of rivers connecting things. And so it's a much easier part of Europe to move through than the mountains. And so Belgium just happens to be in that path.
Absolutely. So let's get to the war itself. We've talked a little bit about what's been building up and all the wars being declared. So as the war began, it quickly became a global conflict involving other countries and their respective colonies, probably to the surprise of nobody. We already talked about that a little bit. The initial phase of the war saw rapid movements and significant battles. So Germany's advance into France was halted at the First Battle of Marne in September 1914, leading to the establishment of trench warfare, which again, we talked about a little bit in terms of the geography aspect here. France was not expected to last. In the beginning of the war. So Germany was trying to calculate that they could take it over. They were expecting to sort of barrel roll them through. France actually ended up surviving pretty well overall, considering.
It's interesting to think about that. When we look back on history and it's a world war, we think of that it dragged on for years, and who would want to get in a conflict like that? But the leaders are thinking, this is not going to last years. This is something that can be taken care of in maybe a few months or something like that. Or I mean, they're not expecting to engage in a war that lasts years and years. But once it starts and once they begin, they're committed to it. But with the hindsight of history, it's important to remind ourselves what was going on then.
You know, it's almost like a tale as old as time, right? I mean, you can look at modern sort of conflicts, such as, you know, the U.S. invasion of Iraq and was that 2002 or 2003? I can't remember exactly. And then, you know, a month later, you know, then President Bush at the time was on an aircraft carrier with mission accomplished behind him. And the U.S. wouldn't ultimately leave Iraq for, what, another 15 years after that or something like that? I don't know. I don't have my dates down. Maybe we'll have to do that conflict at some point as well. But that's ringing a similar bell, right? It's like the U.S. was expecting this to all be wrapped up relatively quickly. And that's rarely how it ever actually turns out.
When the Soviet Union goes into Afghanistan, the United States goes into Afghanistan, they're thinking, we're huge powers. This is something that we can win easily. Yep. And both of those cases, that didn't pan out at all.
Right. So let's jump ahead a little bit. So it's 1915 now. The war is a little bit of a stagnant situation over in the Western Front. Italy at this time decides to join the Allies. If you go back to previous to the war, they were a central power. They sort of switched sides and they joined the Allies by declaring war on Austria-Hungary. This is where you get a lot of the iconic sort of Alpine battles that are, I would say, are pretty famous. And I know some of those stories have been retold through films. Jumping ahead again, because we only have a short amount of time here. 1916, the war had really at this point become a stalemate with massive offensives on the Western Front, resulting in enormous casualties, but almost no territorial gain. Again, this is going back, you know, and sort of looking at sort of France and Germany at the beginning of this war. I don't think it was incorrect for Germany to assume that they would have the upper hand and could relatively, you know, close off France pretty quickly and sort of, you know, move on to other things. And I think this is where we get to the Battle of Verdun, which lasted from February to December 1916. So that's a long battle, where France really held their own against a force that they were not expected to. Both sides lost an incredible amount of people. As we covered already. You could say the same for Battle of Somme. Again, these were just battles that really kept the Allies in it in a way that they weren't expected to. I think that's pretty impressive on behalf of France.
Yeah, the boundaries, the territory, the front line isn't moving very much, right? Right. No. But in order to even keep that stalemate involves the sacrifice of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives.
Absolutely. And so it wouldn't be until 1917 that things really started to change in this war. So Russia, at this point in 1917, was really starting to get weakened internally because of political sort of upheavals, military defeats. And then this was also the time when they experienced the February Revolution, which would lead to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and establish a provisional government in Russia. And so, again, Russia is trying to fight a really big war here and is having a lot of internal issues. Later that year in 1917 is when the Bolshevik Revolution would occur, and this would lead to Russia's full withdrawal from the war after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918. And this is kind of what allowed Germany to then focus on the Western Front, right? It didn't have to worry about Russia anymore. And so it can entirely focus on the Western Front. This might seem really bad for the Allies. In fact, it probably really would have been very, very bad for the Allies had this not also been the same year that the United States decided to enter the war. And so if you can imagine, it's 1917, the war's been going on for 3 years. France, Britain, all these countries, Germany even, probably pretty fatigued. And now all of a sudden there's a fresh new country with a lot of troops that are able to enter into France and start fighting again. And that's kind of what the United States did. So American involvement was kind of crucial for boosting the morale of the Allies overall and tipping the balance of power, right? So that stalemate was a stalemate still. However, with all of the new troops from the United States, they were able to push through. The German spring offensive of 1918 aimed to deliver a decisive blow before American forces could arrive. U.S. entered in 1917. It would take a while to mobilize and get troops over there en masse, but it ultimately failed. And so had that been successful, who knows what would have happened. By the summer of 1918, the Allies launched a series of very successful offensives, culminating in the 100 Days Offensive, which pushed German forces back and led to the collapse of the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire faced internal revolts and military defeats, leading to their eventual surrender as well. And the war officially ended with the signing of the Armistice of Compiègne on November 11th, 1918. And then, of course, some of those treaties that we've all heard about, Treaty of Versailles, would come afterwards. There are huge global impacts that come after all of this, right? So we've talked sort of about the history, we've talked about the geography. We are going to get to some of those impacts sort of for our final part here, but we have to hit our final ad break. And we're back. We're talking about the World War I. Geography is World War I, rather. And we just ran through the history. We've done some geography stuff. Now we're going to get to sort of the lasting impacts of this globally defining war, which I think is probably the very least you could probably say about it. Let's talk about sort of the economy, right? Because I think that's one aspect we always sort of hint on this, you know, sort of the aspect that there are global ramifications. After the war, the global economy was profoundly changed. Hunter, how might you think the economy was changed by World War I? Like, what's coming to your mind? What strings is it pulling?
Well, I'm thinking after 4 years-ish of war that European countries all of them are maybe struggling a bit because there's been there's been a loss of life, there's been a loss of infrastructure. The economies are retooled towards the war. And so it would seem that this was probably a mess.
Yeah. I mean, Europe was devastated, right? It's, again, we call this a world war, and in some respects it is. But what it really is a European dominated war, right? And so a lot of these places around Europe get utterly and completely destroyed. And the economies of these really big powers are also destroyed, right? It doesn't matter if you're a winner or a loser in this war. You're feeling this. You're feeling this pinch. So the massive expenditure of all of this on the conflict left many European economies in shambles. So the United Kingdom and France faced enormous debts, primarily to the United States, as it turns out, which this is kind of the period of time when you can start to say, okay, the U.S. is emerging as not just a military power, but a global economic power, one that's can potentially stand up to sort of what at the time had been the hegemony of European empires, right? And so I have some really fun-ish statistics here. So according to the U.S. State Department, although the amounts borrowed by World War I allies totaled approximately $12.4 billion at the time, which was a lot of money at the time, by the way, the amount outstanding had grown to $31.6 billion by December 31st, 1994, which is the last statistics I could find, which included accrued but unpaid interest and after all the deduction for all previous payments made. So as of 1994, the Allies still owed the United States about $31 billion for this war by itself, which I think is a funny. I know, right? Some countries, however, including Cuba, Finland, Hungary, Liberia, and Nicaragua, paid their World War I debts to the U.S. in full. Although I also have here that it says that the amounts originally lent to these countries were relatively small. Now,
so what's that all about? I mean, these are not countries we've really come up in our conversation so much.
Right.
So what's going on here?
You know, it's interesting because I'm not 100% sure for each individual country. But I dived into, for example, Hungary a little bit, and obviously the U.S. wasn't lending Hungary during the war for their war efforts, but they did lend Hungary money for their post-war reconstruction. And so the same could probably be said for Finland. The others, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Liberia, it's probably funding them to go fight on behalf of other powers that be, right? And again, I'm not sure on the nuances of that. But there was a specific mention inside this U.S. State Department document that's like, but these are the countries that had paid everything off, which I thought was funny because it's this weird mishmash of countries, right?
It's not what you first think of when you think of World War I. No. But I guess this helps suggest the globalness, the worldness of World War I. Yeah.
Yeah. So the war had overall disrupted global trade and production. Again, during this time, Europe was the center of the economic world, right? That's where most of the world was colonized by various European powers at the time. And this was where most of the money was flowing into and most of where the trade was happening. So this was all disrupted by this war. And this led to a shift in the economic dominance from Europe to the United States. And that's sort of, again, that's where we start to see that happen. Of course, this gets exacerbated with later conflicts such as World War II. The post-war period saw an economic boom in the U.S., known as the Roaring '20s, while Europe struggled with reconstruction and economic instability. And so that's kind of where we see the difference, right? So the U.S. did not have bombs being dropped on its cities. It had soldiers in the war, but was otherwise fairly immune to the actual direct impacts of the war. And this allowed for it to almost leapfrog all of those other global empires.
And was also feeling pretty burned by the very significant loss of life that the United States experienced. And so really goes into this period of what's sometimes called isolationism, right? So the 1920s, let's just keep to ourselves here a little bit. And, the U.S. economy is much stronger by rapport of the European economies. And as you're suggesting, unlike the 1800s, the United States starts to emerge as a great power as well.
Right. I think there's a mentality within the United States at the time. It's like, we're very wealthy. We're very big. We're over here on the other side of the world. We have everything we could possibly need. Why did we even need to be involved in World War I? Why did we need to inject ourselves in that? There was no reason for us to.
One of the impacts of that as well is that the United States starts to institute a quota system for immigration. So starting in the 1920s, immigration to the United States from different parts of the world, Europe in particular, which had been pretty massive up until that point, really became like a trickle that was just a small number of people. And it wasn't until after World War II, when the United States had this economic rebound, that these quotas were amended and a lot more immigrants were permitted to legally come into the country.
Yeah. So one of the other things that came out of this was an organization that Well, it's called the League of Nations. Hunter, do you know what this organization was?
The League of Nations was an attempt to create a global political organization whereby different countries would join. And I think one of the main goals was try to garner some international stability. So if you had a global political organization that started cooperating in certain ways, the idea was to create less of a atmosphere for war and more of an atmosphere for business. It didn't really take off, but it was the precursor to the United Nations.
Right. And it's funny because we were just talking about the United States entering into this isolationist period, and one of the things they opted not to do was join the League of Nations.
Right. When it was Wilson's idea, right? What President Woodrow Wilson's idea. Like, well, actually, we don't want to do that after all.
Right. We're like,
I know we came up with the idea, but we're not doing it.
We'll set it up for you. But you guys manage it yourself and, figure it out. And, we're just going to keep hanging out over here. And obviously that didn't pan out super well. Because, clearly, right, there's no League of Nations today. There's the United Nations, but that wasn't a direct, it's not like the League of Nations changed their name and rebranded one day. It's like a whole new thing.
It's a whole different thing. And probably looking at the League of Nations and how can we do that differently. But yeah, and the impetus was the same, which was, again, now that global communications are at the point that they're at, and this war had brought in so many different elements, countries from around the world, the idea is, well, there should be a venue, there should be a forum for talking about things so that we can try to settle things as best we can before we have another situation like this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. This, unfortunately, one of the other downfalls of the League of Nations would ultimately be the Great Depression as well, right? So the economic instability and the political tensions of sort of this whole post-war period were greatly exacerbated by the Great Depression, which contributed ultimately to the rise of authoritarian regimes, for which the League of Nations was just simply not equipped to deal with, right? So this is during the period of time when the Weimar Republic and post-war Germany was sort of toppled, and then the Nazi regime would come into power, right? So this was, again, the League of Nations was never equipped to handle any of this kind of stuff, certainly without the direct involvement of the United States, for example.
It would assume a certain amount of stability within each country, and that wasn't the case. And so you can't have a League of Nations if the countries themselves are having giant disputes internally.
Right. So let's switch gears a little bit here, and let's talk about some of maybe the border changes that would occur. And we've talked a little bit about that inside our geography and history part, but let's dive into it a little bit more in depth. So the dismantling of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires would drastically change sort of the European political landscape. Obviously, how could it not? The Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919 and the Treaty of Trianon in 1920 dismembered Austria-Hungary, creating new states like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and an expanded Romania. Yugoslavia, I think, is a really interesting sort of emergence from all of this because, listener, if you're unaware, Yugoslavia was a former country that comprised the independent nations of Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and I'm probably forgetting one more, Kosovo. There you go. All of which are now their own independent republics, with the kind of exception of Kosovo, which is a whole other thing.
Yeah, it's not widely recognized it's recognized by some countries, not others, but it's not recognized by the United Nations.
Right, correct. Austria and Hungary themselves would be broken out of this, Austrian-Hungarian Empire and become just smaller independent countries. And again, we talked about this. The Austrian-Hungary Empire was not just Austria and Hungary combined, right? So these are just relatively small countries that are now independent from each other as well. Hungary, by the way, has a fascinating history that, again, probably maybe a future episode, just linguistically fascinating unto themselves. Listen, if you're unaware, Hungarian is not a Germanic or Latin language, which makes it very interesting, given its geographic location. These changes led to significant population movements throughout this sort of region of Europe. So ethnic groups found themselves within new countries led by people of other ethnicities, and that often doesn't bode well for certain ethnicities, given the context of the time. So, for instance, many ethnic Germans migrated from the newly created nations to Germany or Austria, where they could speak German predominantly, while ethnic Hungarians relocated to Hungary from other neighboring states, and so on and so forth, right? This is where you start to see a lot of this movement. This obviously doesn't all happen at once. There are other things that happen over the next century that also, do this. But this is sort of one of those key moments where you start to see migration patterns based on this, through at least in this region.
And this relates to the rise of the modern state system, which is this idea that you demarcate an area of territory that's supposed to be for a particular group of people, when throughout most of human history, that's not the way that things work. People who identified with different religions or different ethnicities, sometimes lived in close proximity to each other. And it wasn't that there wasn't any warfare, but now we get into the situation where the idea is you have one place that's supposed to relate to one ethnicity, and that leaves everybody else out. And so this really sows the seeds of conflict that we're still experiencing today.
It's I think we've spoken about this quite a lot. It's a Treaty of Westphalia that sort of like kind of starts this idea, right?
One of the main things that puts it into, and that was 1648, and it doesn't happen overnight, but that's where we start to move towards the kind of countries that we think about today. Right.
So the fall of the Ottoman Empire is also another big moment, right? So formalized by the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, this led to the creation of modern-day Turkey and the division of the Ottoman territories into British and French mandates. These would include Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, which we mentioned already. The redrawing of these borders in Southwest Asia or the Middle East, if you want to call it that, caused large-scale migrations and ethnic conflicts in these areas. And this is we've harped on this before in this podcast, but this gets, this is the core of the power of maps, right? And being able to just draw lines and say, this is sort of the demarcation between this and this, without any sort of local context for what you're actually doing. And this region, as well as Africa, as well as South America, and as well as a lot of other parts of the world, are prime examples of sort of what colonial Europe did to these areas.
Yeah, cartography plus nationalism equals a lot of bad history.
Yeah, to say the very least. Yeah. Let's jump over to Russia because we can't talk about this all day long. The war significantly influenced Russia. So the Russian Revolution occurred primarily as a byproduct of the war. Now, that's not to say that had the war not happened, this wouldn't have eventually occurred. There was a lot of internal strife. Russia's a very big country, as I'm sure most people know, and that means there's a lot of different groups vying for power. Previously, it was under the Tsar Nicholas II during this time. However, the war caused immense strain on the Russian society, the economy, certainly, we've talked about that, and then the collapse of their military, which they were suffering some key defeats, hastened the expulsion of the Romanov dynasty, which was sort of the Tsar at the time. And so the February Revolution of 1917 led to the abdication of the Tsar, and would eventually led to the Bolshevik Revolution, which under Vladimir Lenin promised peace, land, and bread for Russians, and was really the precursor to what would become the Soviet Union. And now, if that is not a huge geographic ramification for the world, I don't know what else is, right? That's a really big one, right? The establishment of what would ultimately become the USSR, or the Soviet Union, one of the great political powers of the 1900s, military and political powers, directly vying with the United States and Western Europe for geopolitical dominance, all sort of stemmed out of this one moment, this Bolshevik Revolution. So under the treaty that they signed, Bolshevik Russia, with Germany in order for them to leave the war a little early. So under the treaty, Russia would lose control of Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and its Baltic governorates, which is now Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as its Caucasus provinces of Kars and Batum. So they would actually lose quite a bit of land. However, again, it was a different. The Bolsheviks did not have the same goals in mind as imperialist Russia, right? This was a completely different idea. And finally, let's talk a little bit about Germany, because we've sort of stepped all around them at this point. Germany had some vast repercussions by losing the war as well. So going back, to sort of what we spoke about earlier, they were a very dominant military and economic power, right? They had won the Franco-Prussian War pretty handily against France, which at that time was considered to be the preeminent military power in Europe. And so they were sort of flying high heading into this war. Their defeat and the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 really did sow a lot of seeds of discontentment within the country, right? It was they were kind of thinking of it as a big shame. In fact, I've read other pieces of journals and scholarly written articles about the impact that a lot of the German military commanders felt about the surrender, where they didn't necessarily agree with it. And so you start to think about what that does to a country that is ultimately very proud at this moment, right? And so to pile on top of that, just the act of the surrender, the treaty imposed severe reparations on Germany, territorial losses, right? They lost quite a lot of land, and military restrictions, right? They weren't allowed to do various military things anymore. The government that came into power afterwards, which was called the Weimar Republic, they faced a lot of these issues, and they were the ones that were left to deal with it. Now, there were some, it wasn't all bad times, right? But again, this would be compounded even further when the Great Depression would sweep across the world. And so Germany, again, very proud, lost a lot of land, a lot of people very discontented by sort of losing the war. Then the Great Depression happens, and what you start to see is there's conditions that become really rather fertile for political ideologies that really lean heavily into nationalism and this idea that we deserve more, that we need to take back our rightful place, and then some. And that's where we get to, a man named Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party.
Right. You have nationalist leaders, and Hitler, an Austrian, not a German. But the idea is to cast a discourse, a narrative that we can only realize our true potential as a country and as a people if we are able to have the full extent of our territory, right. And to, we should be the ones running things. And so the 20th century is rife with this kind of nationalist leaders who bring a lot of conflict to the world. Absolutely.
And Hunter, that's ultimately where we're going to leave today's episode, because that gets us dangerously close to World War II, and we don't have enough time. That's for another time. But that said, listener, if you do want more information, we covered everything pretty high level today. We have a really great episode coming out on Thursday with Jesse Alexander of The Great War and Real-Time History over on the YouTube, I should say. You can go and listen to that on Thursday. It really dives into a lot more of the nuance that we kind of just glossed over, and I think that's putting it nicely.
We've got a true expert on, and we know some stuff about various things, but we do a lot of research for our episodes, and some of these things are things that we have some expertise in, but we're kind of a generalist approach here. And so to have geographers and historians should be hanging out anyways, right? Because it's Absolutely. Time and space. So here we have a chance to hang out with a historian. Please come and join us, because you'll learn a lot. I think that
Absolutely. Yep. So with that, Hunter, who are you? Where can people find you?
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portland as a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities. which I see in the background there, Jeff, a cultural atlas of, there it is, of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. David Banas is the co-author there. And I am co-host with you, Jeff, of Geography is Everything.
Yeah, my name's Jeff Gibson, co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. You can also find me over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Jeff, where I do other geography things, usually based around population of some sort. If you want this podcast delivered straight to your email, you can. It's just go over to geographyiseverything.substack.com and you can sign up there. It's totally free. And you just get a once a week email, maybe twice a week now, because we have another episode coming out later this week. If you liked what you heard today, you learned a lot about World War I, please rate and review us over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever app you use. Really helps us out, and we really appreciate seeing those. Once again, call out for next time. Come back on Thursday, I should say. Listen to our interview with Jesse Alexander. That's going to be really fun. Next week, we are going to tackle your summer vacation, which I think is going to be a really fascinating topic.
Yeah.
It is. It's kind of like podcast whiplash, going from World War I to summer vacations. Like,
that's right. Yeah.
Both are going to be very heavily Europe dominated. I mean, there's going to be other stuff, but there's a lot of people vacationing in Europe this year.
I'm sure there's connections to be made somehow. Maybe we can find some of those.
Yeah. We'll see. So come back next week. Come back on Thursday. Come back next week. Get those podcasts. And I guess until then, we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening.